The internet is one of our best companions for learning languages. Anytime, anywhere, you can search anything, but there is a limit. And the reason is, there is a huge amount of information that hasn't been translated into Japanese yet. And if you're not a native, diving into all of these different websites is pretty tough.
いいじゃん、埼玉ゼロカーボン。
この漢字何？ただゴミの分別仕方知りたいんだよ。
That's why today, I want to introduce to you a fantastic website where English learners and native teachers from all around the world come together to talk about English. Welcome to the world of Reddit, where people come together to ask and answer the world's questions. Today, we'll answer some questions, have a look at some really interesting pictures, and discuss the latest vocabulary used by natives. Ready? Let's have a look. What's the difference between disease and condition? Now, this is a very good question and a common mistake that I see many people make. What do you think is the difference between disease and condition? Here, I'll give you a hint. On the left, you can see 3 examples of diseases, and on the right are 3 conditions. What is the common point that connects the 3 diseases and the common thing that connects the 3 conditions? Did you get it? The answer is quite simple. Diseases are caused by bacteria and viruses. They're usually physical problems that affect the body. However, conditions are often mental, and they're usually caused by emotional or traumatic events. Got it? Let's move on. Okay, so it looks like we have an adorable picture of a shark here, and at the bottom you can see the sentence, "That shark is suffocating." Do you have any idea what suffocating means? Suffocating means not being able to breathe or have access to oxygen. Now, as you may know, sharks and many other fish have these holes on the side of their body, and water flows through them, and this is how they breathe or get oxygen. By the way, these holes that fish use to breathe are called gills. So when sharks or other fish are taken out of the water, they can't breathe anymore. That's why they suffocate. Now, on the flip side, if you put a human underwater for a long period of time, they will also not be able to breathe. But in water, when you can't breathe, there's a special word for this. In this case, we would say drown. However, let's imagine you are above water in a building and suddenly there's a big fire. What happens when there's a fire? There is smoke that comes into the room, and then you can't breathe in that smoke because you'll start coughing and it will damage your lungs. So in this case, you can't access clean air or oxygen, so you start to suffocate. And there is one more useful word. When you're eating, let's say you're eating your favorite cream puff, you're like starving, you haven't eaten anything all day, and you just eat the whole thing in one go. And then you go, you start to choke. Choke means not being able to breathe because there's something stuck. Usually food, or maybe if it's a young child, like a Lego or some small toy, something is blocking your throat. So, there are 3 useful words here. If you're in the water and you can't breathe, you drown. If you're above water and you can't breathe because of smoke or some other reason, you suffocate. However, if there's something inside and blocking your throat, you choke. So, have you ever choked when eating your favorite food? I did. First time I went to Japan, I had some delicious ramen. I was so hungry, so I was eating very quickly and I started choking on the ramen, so I had to pull it out. Oh, it was gross, but yeah, the ramen, delicious. Okay, next one. Personally, bad English is such a turn off for me. you don't need to put for me after writing personally. So this person is saying Nikki's sentence, personally bad English is such a turn-off for me, is redundant. In other words, personally and for me have the same meaning, so you don't need both. You can say, personally bad English is such a turn-off, or bad English is such a turn-off for me. Now, you might have noticed there's a more interesting phrase, turn off. You might know the normal meaning of turn off, which means to turn off or turn on a light. But turn off has another interesting meaning when it comes to romance and dating. A turn off, which is a noun, is some personality or physical characteristic that is romantically unattractive. Common turn-offs are things like being very rude to restaurant staff or people who don't shower very often and so they smell a bit, stinky. And the opposite would be a turn-on. Some common turn-ons for men are usually things like, a nice dress, good clothes. For women, of course, some muscle, not too much, is good. But there's this thing where it's if they have veins, you can see the veins on their arms when they, roll up their sleeves. It's very attractive and it's a big turn-on, I've heard. But there you go. Anyway, let's change the topic. Let's have a look at a problem that I think many people can relate to. So, I just want to ask you guys, what's your recommended app or website for enhancing your English language speaking and comprehension? And most of the times when I watch a Western Hollywood movies, I often cannot understand the subtitles. First of all, recommended app or website. Now, personally from my experience, I don't use apps that much. I think they're great as a little bit of extra practice. Flashcards when you're on the train, on the way to work or school. It's a nice way of just doing a bit of extra practice, but when it comes to serious study, I think websites, books are much better. As for apps, I've heard that Elsa Speak is really good for pronunciation. As for websites, of course, YouTube is great. But there's one website that I would highly recommend to everyone, and that is the website Youglish. You can search any English word. For example, let's say you're watching Harry Potter and you hear a new word. For example, do you know the stick that they use to cast magic? This is called a wand. So if you put wand into Youglish, it will show you all videos on YouTube that use the word wand. And it's really good because it even skips to the part where they use the word wand.
If you want to. How many times did Daniel Radcliffe break his wand? This is a rumour I would like to disperse. There is a thing that I sometimes see on Twitter.
And finally, a very common problem is watching movies and not understanding the subtitles. It's almost impossible to understand 100% of the language in movies. For example, science fiction or fantasy movies and dramas are a lot more difficult to understand than comedy or romance, because they're much more different to everyday life. And here is a really important point. When it comes to using books or movies, dramas as a way to get new vocabulary, there are two things you have to think about. One, how much do I enjoy this genre and these kinds of stories? And two, how useful are these words for me in my everyday life? For example, let's say you love fantasy, Harry Potter, but fantasy and the words that appear in those dramas and movies, for example, wand, we never really use it in our everyday life. It's not super useful. However, if you really enjoy talking about fantasy, for example, when you meet with your friends, you always talk about the latest fantasy anime or, a movie or a book that you read, then it might be a good idea to learn that language in English, because when you go abroad and you meet new people and they ask you, hey, do you have any hobbies or what kind of movies do you like? Then It will be a chance for you to show your interest and talk about your passion of fantasy. So, yeah, it really depends on your interests and how useful the words are. Okay, let's move on. Alright, and here we have a very interesting... I see. This is actually very useful. Can you see what this picture is trying to show? So here it's saying on is used with vehicles that you can stand up inside of, things that are generally a bit larger, like planes and ships. But for smaller vehicles where you can't stand up inside, we use in. That is really interesting, and actually I didn't know about this, so this is actually really useful for me as a teacher. Wow, great picture. So let's end it there for today, otherwise this video is going to be way too long. But there are still a lot of questions, comments, and useful vocabulary on this website that I want to show to you, so we'll have a look at that next time. But for now, have a wonderful day, and bye for now!